install a new clutch, new flywheel, pilot bearing, and throwout bearing on the Subaru today. It's a 2015. This is really similar process to earlier models like 12 to 14. Almost identical, just slightly different. And it should be exactly the same for 15 through 21, I believe. Same generation. A lot of places will take the motor out to do this, but I'm going to do this from under the car without removing the engine. So you can do either method, but this one will be from under the car. We're just going to pull the transmission out of the bottom. So you have to take your wheels off and axles out so that you can do that. For those wondering, this is a ACT street light flywheel. It's somewhere around 13 pounds, give or take a pound. Stocker's like around 20, 21, something like that. I could be off a few pounds on each, but we're going with a lighter flywheel. It's not quite as light as like the Fidanza flywheel, but based on our research, this is what we want to go with for drivability and feedback. And this is the X clutch kit. Comes with the bearing, pressure plate, clutch, all that, and it's just the street series or whatever, the organic clutch, but it is supposed to hold a little more torque than factory. After we get this clutch and flywheel in here, within the next few months we'll be installing cob access port, stage 1 and all that, so we'll have videos on that coming up as well. But let's get to this install. So you want to start by disconnecting your battery. Gotta get this cover off of here, which just pop these little pins out. The front just kind of pops out from there. Pop these pins out, take your cover off, because we need to take the top mount intercooler off, because there's a few things underneath of it that we need to get to. So to get that out, on this side I just removed this bracket, unbolt it. You got a hose clamp down here, and then one here, and then the bracket there, and then you just kind of wiggle and pop it out. So you got a few things to disconnect up here. You want to take this bracket off here that has your ground wire on it, or detach your ground wire. I believe this bracket needs to come off because you got to remove your starter as well. Your slave cylinder here, 2 bolts to unbolt it. Leave the hydraulic line on, but unbolt it from the transmission and set that aside. These right here are going to need not only unplugged, but you're going to have to take this bracket off too, which down under here there's a little bolt to take this bracket off. You get to take this mount right here off as well. This big one here should be fine staying plugged in. It's just as long as you take this mount off or unplug it there, and obviously you're gonna have to unclip those. You got this little ground wire here too you need to disconnect that I forgot about. And to get this 14 mil, but you're gonna need a 14 mil on both sides because you got bolt and nut, so this nut's gonna spin as you try to back the bolt out. Careful you don't lose your washers when you take that out. Alright, so before I take the weight off the car by lifting it in the air, I'm going to try to get this axle nut. If the wheel spins, you just have somebody get in it and hold on the brake pedal real heavy. But pop your center cap off. You just use a little flathead screwdriver. And there's your axle nut. It's 32 millimeter, but you got to bend this little metal up. See, when on reinstall, you hammer it down in there. It keeps that axle nut from potentially coming loose. So I got to get in there with a punch, screwdriver, whatever, and get that lip punched up so they can remove the axle nut. And obviously you're going to have to do this on both sides. Also, it's recommended to replace the axle nuts whenever you take them off. So from what I looked up, this is a 32, which I do not have. But you see how snug this fits? About as tight as a 32 would, and that's 1 1/4. So you're either going to need a real beastie impact to get that off, or a really long breaker bar with probably a pipe on it as well for extra leverage. After you get the axle nut loose 1 or 2 turns, then do the same with your lug nuts. Alright, once you have the car up securely, you need to drain the transmission fluid. I need a T70 Torx bit for that, which I don't have. So I need to run in town to grab that, but in the meantime, I'm going to work on the other stuff under here to see how far I can get before I got to run in town and go grab that in my fluid. Alright, so I'm under the car now. That's the rear. We're going to have to pull this drive shaft out, which means we got to take this heat shield out of the way. I see most people move the exhaust, but I'm going to see if I can get that shaft out without removing the exhaust, because as you can see, I might still have to move it anyways for the trans, but I'm not sure. It almost looks like it'll come out, but we'll see. I'm gonna get the shield off of here and work on getting this drive shaft out. All right, so there's the shield down, and then you need to come to the rear. These bolts here, a lot of people like to mark it. You can put it back on the same orientation. A lot of people believe if you don't, it can cause vibrations because it's balanced and all that. So anyways, mark it if you want. Bolts on that was 12 mil, and I believe that's what these are too. All right, so I got 3 of those 4 bolts, but I couldn't reach the one up top. So you're gonna have to have the rear wheels off the ground or off. That way you can spin this drive shaft. It'll separate from here. So I might have to just like lightly tap in the corners, flat blade screwdriver, or just pull forward if it's not stuck on there, and it'll just drop right off in your face like it did to me. So then we got this center piece we got to remove. These 2 bolts here, drop this center section, and it should just pull out of the transmission. 2 bolts, 14 millimeter for me. So this should just pull out now. Yep, there it goes. So you got some things to remove from the transmission still, like these shift cables or whatever on the side here. You know, some more of this crap, and I'll show all that. Electrical connectors, the starter up here. But I'm gonna go ahead and start working on removing these cross members here. This front one's a 17 millimeter. You definitely want to use a 6-point socket, not a 12-point, or you might round the edges because these ones are going to be real tight. I know the torque spec on this is like 100 foot-pounds or something when you put it back in. All the other ones are 14 mil. This will drop an inch or 2, so don't freak out. It's not going to fall on your face. See how the whole thing's wiggling now? Remember, we took that top mount out up there, so that's why the whole thing's loose now. It's just basically hanging on the weight of these bolts, which we'll have to support this with a jack and all that when we break those loose, but we'll get to that. There's your trans mount, still bolted to the trans. So this right here, you would have to unbolt, but interestingly, mine is broken. So your exhaust is bolted here. So you have to take these 2 bolts out. You might even want to take that front one out too to just get that out of your way. So I was explaining here, you got to remove this little bracket to get to your shift cables, but if you're only going to put the transmission on the ground just a foot or 2 under the car like I did, then you actually don't have to remove those. You only need to remove them, the shift cables, if you're going to completely remove the transmission. All right, so there's that little shield. Those are 12 millimeter for me, and then that's what's above it. So you pull the pin out, and then you should be able to slide it off that way, and then it connects right here to this bracket. You'll just have to pull that clip out. Here's my hand. Get a screwdriver or whatever. You got to pry this piece right here. It'll slip off that way. The line pulls out towards the front of the car. So there's another line like this right here, and I believe it's a ball and socket type, and you just pop it off, but it's real hard to get your hand up in there. Also, you may not even have to pop these out. It depends on how you want to do it. It looks like you can just take these brackets off and then leave those lines connected to the brackets if you take the brackets off. Either way, I'm going to wait until I get everything else done and drop this down so I can get to that top line a little more easily. So then I'm going to come around the other side here. This is where the lines wrap around, and then they go up to where your shifter is. So you got to get pushed up over here so they don't catch over that tab. Where is this? I'm trying to... That. Okay, because the lines want to catch on that. So I'm going to go ahead and push those up and over that and double check those again before I drop it. Then you got this bolt right here. It's clamped around. You want to take that off. That way as you drop it, it's not going to pinch these lines or anything. There's your starter. Like I said, the starter's got to come out too. So again, I still got to go to the store to get the T70 bit I need. So I'm going to go ahead and take my wheels off and probably unbolt what I need to, the strut there, so that we're ready to pull the axles out. And then I'll run in town and get what I need, come back, yank out the axles, and we'll get the transmission off. So with the axle nut off, then we need to unbolt this control arm, spindle, whatever you would call it. off the strut. So you're gonna need a wrench on one end, ratchet and socket on the other end, because you gotta hold the nut still while you back the bolt out here and here, or use an impact. And then that'll allow you to tip this out so you can push the axle through and around and then pull it out of the transmission. But you don't want to catch any of these lines in doing so, so you'll want to unbolt your brake line here, take this out of there, just little push tabs, just pop it off from there and give yourself even more leeway, and that should be plenty once you unbolt from here. Then you can tap these out with a hammer. So these are coming out pretty easy for me, but sometimes they'll be really stuck in there. Just make sure you don't mushroom out the head on that with whatever you're trying to tap it out with. If you do, then you won't be able to get your nut back on. So that should just kind of hang there like that. I got plenty of room with my brake line disconnected. I got plenty of room with that, and then you can pick this up and move it whichever way you need so that you can pull the axle out. Over here on the other side, and I just wanted to point out, I wasn't sure until I came around here. For some reason the top side has this washer and the bottom doesn't. It was like that on both sides, so make sure you put that washer on the top on both sides when you put it back together. So there's the axle coming out. Depending on the angle, because this is kind of pinching it, you just stick something in there, tap on it lightly, it'll pop out. And once you get it out to this far, it compresses right here, comes in and out in that rubber boot. I think the same here. So if you push hard enough and get the right angle, you can get it popped out of there and just up and away from everything. All right, I got my T70 bit. I just broke that free fluid. Oh, nice. But to get your axles out, you're basically just going to come behind it with a thin crowbar, stick it between there, and it might take a few tries. I'm going to get under this, it'll be a lot easier. There you go. I think it already started to push out. Not the different combination of things, and it's kind of hard to do one-handed while recording, but okay, so yeah, it did pop out those few millimeters like I thought. You can see that's what it did look like. And then I just grabbed it with both hands and wiggled and pulled back, and it popped out that far. So yeah, it's ready to come out now. So that was real easy. Some of them be difficult. You have to pry real hard to pop them loose, but this one for me today was real easy. Also, when you pull it out, get it as far out as you can by pulling on this cup here. Because remember, this goes in and out like an accordion, and there's ball bearings and knuckles and gears and stuff in there. So you don't want to separate this. You can get them jammed up. Alright, so with it drained and the axle's pulled out, I'm ready to drop this thing. Double check, triple check everything, make sure everything's disconnected. As I said, I still got that line up top to disconnect, but I'm gonna check that out as when I drop it down, so I have more room. Go ahead and snug that back up so it won't be dripping on you. Obviously, if you tip it, it's gonna drip on you. So I gotta finish unbolting the starter, move the starter out of the way, and then I believe it's 3 bolts on each side, and then it should be free. Other than there's slide pins that it rides on. I'll show all this in more detail once I get it off and everything, because obviously I'm not going to be able to do this while recording. But you got to get your jack under it, jack it up some. It might take a while to find a sweet spot, but basically lift up and roughly in a neutral zone or back kind of where it was, because you don't want all the weight hanging down and it's tipping the motor down and all that. You want to kind of get it to where it's sitting with as least amount of tension as possible up there, so when you're wiggling it and prying on it, trying to get it to pop off of those guide pins, you know, it's not going to fight you too much. And then obviously you want it supported so it doesn't fall in your face, which this shouldn't be too heavy. It should be under 100 pounds, but obviously it's solid metal, so but yeah.
Also, by the way, it's recommended to replace the transmission plug seal gasket thing there whenever you remove it. That way you're sure you don't have any leaks.
Alright, so I've been tapping around and prying around on this. There's not very many spots to do it. From up top, I was able to hook a ball joint fork against some things and tap lightly with my steel mallet against the pickle fork. You want to be careful because it's easy to bust these cases, so just enough to put a vibration through it to try to break the seal. The main problem is these pins it's sitting on. See that rusty pin right there? There's one on each side. I discussed that earlier. Metal pin that goes through. So after I tapped around on it, I did try here initially, and I was afraid I was going to bust the case with as hard as I was prying. But then after I tapped around on it up top and a few places on both sides with my hammer, again, not too hard, not wanting to bust the case, I then stuck that little short stubby wide flathead screwdriver in that hole there, pried back, and now it is finally starting to come, and I'll show you in a sec. You can see, it might be hard to see with the glare, but I got the screwdriver shoved between the back of the engine and the transmission case there now, so I do have separation now. So I'm going to continue working on it. There's not really much to pry on. Like, there's not a little hole like this on the other side, but now I at least got this side loose, so now I can grab it and wiggle it back and forth with my hands at least to try to bust the seal on the other side. It just takes a little patience, but after some tapping around, prying in there, I finally got it free. But be careful because you don't want to bust that. Alright, so there's the transmission. There's that pin I was talking about. They might stay in the engine part, or they might come out in the transmission like mine did. Up top, towards the top of the case there, once I got a screwdriver, enough space between to get a screwdriver, I went up top and pried a little bit too, and I actually got it wide enough to where I was able to hammer my ball joint fork in between the engine and the transmission case to spread it out some more. Came under the car, grabbed the thing, was just basically wiggling it back and forth, up and down, and until I was able to pop it back, and then it kind of just sat there. It rides on those bolts right there coming off the engine, okay? So even after you get those pins out, it rides on those bolts, and you got to slide it off of them bolts. So it's got to come out quite a ways to clear those bolts so that you can drop it down. So I just slowly worked on wiggling it off, backing it up with the jack until it was free of those, and then slowly lowered it. So here's the other linkage I was talking about. So this is a ball and socket. It would just pop off, I believe. There's your other bracket. Just like the other one, you would slide that out and then it'll come out just like this one. But if I don't need to move the transmission, then I'm just fine leaving that stuff on there. Don't got to take it off. The only thing is, I'm probably gonna have to move it some so that I can get up in there more comfortably to get the pressure plate, clutch, and flywheel off, and then my throwout bearing or what have you in the front here. So I could probably work on the front with it where it's at, but I don't know. If I can move it just enough so I can get up in there and do what I need to do, I'll leave those lines attached, or if I want to pull the transmission out from under the car completely, then I'll pop those lines off and do so. Before I get any further, if your car is high mileage, which this one is not, we're still under 100,000, you may want to go ahead and replace those seals for the axles. Same for your output shaft there. And then also, obviously, at this point, you would want to replace your throwout bearing, release bearing, whichever you prefer to call it, and the pilot bearing, which I am doing because it came with my kit. Also, everyone always recommends replacing your clutch fork here, because I guess these stock ones are weak and they can bend, which I was going to do until I seen the price of them. So I think we'll just keep using the factory one. So it looks like the throwout bearing just slides off. I'd pay close attention to how it goes on before you take it off. There we go. Just pop off. See, it's got those little tabs that hook around. Oh yeah, listen to that. So we've been hearing some noise when we push in the clutch, and I was saying it was probably the throwout bearing, and you can hear that bearing's bad. So then I just slide the new one on, make sure it hooks around the fork on the back side. Also, when I was prying this thing out of here, I was putting my crowbar between this bottom lip here and this right here, and prying back, and that helped a lot too. Alright, so here's what a good clutch is supposed to look like, or a new clutch I should say. You should definitely see segregation, those little grooves. And then there's what ours looks like. It is completely gone. I've seen a lot of clutch replacements where they still had some of the line in it, and you can see it's just completely all blended together. Both sides. It's even down to hitting the rivets. It's literally flush with the rivets, so yeah. And then there's the friction surface. I can even feel on some of these hot spots, I can feel it like lumped. So yeah, this thing's definitely fried. This thing is long fried. The flywheel actually doesn't look too bad, but it's always recommended to get your flywheel resurfaced when you put in a new clutch. But we're just putting in a new flywheel, and that's because, one, I don't want to have to go through resurfacing, find someone to resurface, blah blah blah. But mostly for a performance aspect, we're going with a much lighter flywheel so that the car will rev faster and we won't have so much rev hang between gears. But if you keep the flywheel that's on it, you're supposed to get them resurfaced before you put the new clutch on. And that was just 6 little 12mm head bolts that held that on there. Alright, then there's the flywheel. I guess it looks kind of crappy too. There's definitely some heat spots on it, and you can see some, well, if I get real close, some stress cracks. So it's just 8 14mm head bolts for me that held that on. Right there's your pilot bearing. Our new flywheel, yeah, that's pretty you're not supposed to be able to hear them. So our new flywheel comes with one of those, but you should definitely replace your pilot bearing. And by the way, when taking this off and taking this off, you're going to want to use an impact if you can to blast those bolts off of there, because otherwise if you use a regular ratchet and socket, it turns the motor. So if you don't have an impact, you're going to have to lock the flywheel somehow in the case, jam something in the tooth and let it catch on something so it doesn't turn the assembly, or lock the engine via another method, like by the crank pulley or something like that. Alright, I don't remember exactly what this piece is called. You can see that sensor up there reads it as it spins. I've seen where people, this falls out and they don't know which way it goes. So see those little tooth? It goes like this, okay? The flywheel comes off and it's like that. So don't put it that way, or your car won't run. Also, notice that little pin up there on the right hand side of that, okay? You gotta line it up with that hole right there, and it's gotta go on like this, not like this. Alright, so I wouldn't even have been mentioning that if it wasn't for the fact that I already seen somebody screw that up. So for your clutch and flywheel and pressure plate, friction surface, you want to take brake parts cleaner and a clean rag, spray the brake parts cleaner on the rag, a bunch of it, and clean the surface area, okay? Because these come, I can actually see it, you probably can't see it on video, and it actually says in the instructions to do so, because they come with grease on them, oil, whatever, to keep them from rusting while they're in storage, and I can even feel and see that stuff on there. So brake parts cleaner, rag, once or twice, get all the goo off. Same thing on your clutch, obviously that's the old one, but both sides of the clutch, same thing. And then on your pressure plate, your friction surface as well, same thing. And then as you're installing them, if you happen to bump it against anything or touch it with your fingers or whatever, then once you get the part on, then go over it again. You want it as clean as possible. Any dirt and grime on that can cause clutch slippage, can cause it to chatter, cause it to wear prematurely, and the other parts as well. So keep them super clean and prep them by cleaning them with a clean rag and brake parts cleaner before, during, and after install, if you happen to get anything on them, and just in general, because they come with grease on them. Alright, so don't forget that little plate thing under there I just talked about. It barely sits on there, so when you just barely touch it with the flywheel, it'll want to fall on you. And then, you know, it's hard to make sure because you can't really see if that pin's lined up. So the best way I can recommend, for one, be 100% sure that plate behind this is on correct. on the pin, and that you didn't make it fall or turn or anything when you try to put this flywheel in. I actually took mine back off and then put it back on just to be 100% certain, or this thing's going to go on cockeyed, and that's not good. So the best way I found was from down here. I tried up top at first, push that plate back here on real good, and then line the flywheel up the best you can, and then once you get it, shove it on there and keep pressing against it hard so that you don't move any, and allow that plate to drop. And then you'll have to turn it so that you can get one of these bolts started, and start whichever one is closest to where that pin is, whether it's over here, there, depending on where your engine stopped, and tighten it all the way down by hand while you're pressing the flywheel against it, and then you can get your other bolts in. That way, that's the best way I found for me to make sure that that thing didn't move or fall or anything like that. So 100% got to make sure that thing stays on that peg back there. So these are 55 foot-pounds of torque. A lot of people recommend putting some high temp thread locker on that. When they came out, they didn't have any on them, but especially if you're going to be like drag racing and adding a lot more power to the car, it's even more highly recommended then. So if you want, you can put a few drops of high temp thread locker on there to ensure that those don't back out, rattle loose, anything like that. Again, the torque spec is 55 foot-pounds of torque in a crisscross pattern, so don't go like one to the next. You want to go like crisscross star pattern, okay, and then go over it a couple times also. It's turning on me, so I got to find a way. Like I said, oops, I accidentally touched it. I'm going to clean that off again. You can jam it up in here with like a wide flat blade screwdriver or something, stick it between a tooth and something else where it's going to catch as you're turning it, so it'll lock it into place so you can torque those down. Alright, so I've already wiped down both sides of the clutch. Both sides, very important, because you got one side touch your flywheel and one side touch the friction surface of your pressure plate. So I've already cleaned that off with brake parts cleaner. I've been sure not to touch it when I install it. You're going to slide your alignment tool through. A kit should come with it. If you buy the parts individually, you're going to need that alignment tool. So you slide it through the splines on your clutch and stick it in there, and slide the clutch up against the flywheel. It should be clearly marked which side. See there, it says gearbox side, so that faces the transmission, thus the other side faces the flywheel. And for me, all the springs and shit are sticking out on this side, whereas on the other side they are not. So make sure you put it on in the right orientation. You see these little dowel rod pins here on the flywheel. Now I got to get my pressure plate up in there after I clean off the friction surface, line up with those pins, and get my bolts installed. Alright, so it wasn't very clear where those pins go, and it might be different depending on manufacturer of pressure plate and whatnot, and I didn't really pay attention when I took the old one off, but we're lined up now. So mine has this, I don't know, a little cutout groove thing. They look identical in correlation for each one of those. So it's always right next to that elevated hole, and then the hole that's on a lower level. And there was only 3 spots that occurred, so that's I'm going to double check all this, but I do believe that I have it in the correct orientation. Alright, I put the old one back together for reference. So there's a little pocket I was talking about. There's a pin. There's a pin. There's a pin. So that's what you do. On this one, there's only one hole under there that's threaded for the bolt. So on the factory one, you absolutely have to line it up. So I have it in the same orientation up there, but I believe depending on what you get, if it's aftermarket, it might have several slots that you can use. But as far as the factory one goes, and if yours doesn't have that option to where there's multiple threaded holes for your pressure plate mounting bolts, that is the location of the pins, which is what I currently have it in. And then you can go ahead and torque your bolts. 26 foot-pounds, crisscross pattern, and mine came with new ones, so I'm using the new bolts. And I believe you're supposed to replace them anyways. It's recommended at least. Also, same with the flywheel bolts. I still reuse my old ones, but Generally, your kits will come with new pressure plate bolts. And again, those are recommendations for extra assurance. It's not an absolute must, but if you want to go by all the recommendations, you're supposed to replace all the hardware. All right, I got them all torqued down. So it actually does go flush once you torque it down. So I did 2 sets, again in a crisscross pattern at 15 pounds. I did that twice, and then I set it to the final torque value 26 foot-pounds. And then I went over the pattern twice with that as well. So that's fully installed, torqued down. Now I can pull my alignment tool out, get my screwdriver out of there that I used to lock it via the flywheel, so that I could torque this without it turning. And then I got to work on getting the transmission back up in here. All right, so there she is. My kit came with just a little 1/4 ounce of grease. Put on the splines here for the splines on the transmission to match up to. I gotta throw my new throwout bearing on real quick, and other than that, I'm ready to go. This stuff's gonna be kind of dangling in your way, so as you go up in here with the trans, you're gonna have to keep checking stuff. It really helped to have help keep that crap out of the way. Obviously, I only put a very light amount of grease on there and wipe off any excess. So you can't even tell I put any on there. That's how light I did it, because you don't want it spinning and slinging it all over your clutch surfaces, and then your clutch will slip. Same thing for your spline shaft there. I'm going to clean this crap up. Put a little bit of grease on there. Some people, you put a little bit there too when you put your new throwout bearing over. You can get some grease under on this pivot point while you're at it, and the same thing at the top part where your slave cylinder engages with this. But yeah, don't put so much where it goes into the clutch, or it's going to sling it all over the clutch. Alright, so several hours later, just wanted to show you real quick how I got that in there. This is a real effing nightmare trying to do it like this. It must be so much easier to have a lift to where it puts the car above your head, and then you have a proper transmission hoist that rolls over on wheels and cradles the transmission nicely. You know, because for putting it back in, you can just wheel it up, get it, it'll sit there nice and balanced, and then you can just get it nice and lined up and whoop, line it up, super peasy easy. Yeah, this took about 3 hours. So this is kind of what I got going on with jacks like these. When you try to push it, it just wants to tip the jack, because this one doesn't have roller wheels in the front like that where they'll spin around in circles, so that would have really helped. So it could have went with it. Otherwise, put it like that, but you don't really have a lot of clearance under here for that. But I had to lift up one end of the transmission at a time, put blocks under it, then lift up the rear, put blocks under it, just so I could get the jack under it. But I had to get it high enough to fit that wood in, because my jack doesn't go high enough. Otherwise, it's almost maxed out right now because it's a low pro. Anyways, I've been messing with this thing for 2 or 3 hours. I finally got all the bolts back on. We'll reconvene tomorrow and go over some of the tips I learned to get this thing lined up, and we'll get it torqued down. Alright, as you see, I finally got this thing back on here. I already torqued it back down. I put my mount back on, that way I could drop the jacks. So transmission's fully installed, torqued down, it's got the mount back on. Now I just got to work on hooking everything else back up, and we'll go over that in the torque specs and everything. The torque specs for the bolts on the transmission, 37 foot-pounds of torque, which also includes these starter bolts. So these bolts also mount the transmission to the engine, okay? So they don't just hold the starter on there. That's part of the bolts that hold this thing on there.
I just wanted to point out that I forgot to put the bracket back on and that ground wire that we originally removed from the starter there, so make sure you don't forget that. Somehow it started up and ran and drove just fine, but it definitely should be put back on there.
There were 6 bolts total, including these starter bolts. 2 of them are longer than the other 4. So one of the long ones goes here. I tried to stick it in there and it got tight, and I was like, what's going on? Anyways, one of those long ones is there, and the other one is this one right here. So your 4 shorter ones go in the other locations, but this one and that one are your long bolt. 37 foot-pounds of torque for every bolt, including the long ones. And then don't forget, you also got the 2 nuts on the bottom, which are also 37 foot-pounds of torque. So this thing was a real nightmare to line up with the equipment that I have, not having a car lift to get it above my head with the proper trolley to wheel the transmission up and then jack it up, and you know, have plenty of play to line it up. I showed you guys the way I had 2 jacks under it, and it was just a real freaking nightmare. You're gonna want 2 or 3 people if possible to help. Nearly impossible by myself. You got to get it lined up just right so that that shaft that your throwout bearing rides on, the splines will line up with the splines on the clutch disc, okay? So that's the hard part. And even if you get the transmission the perfect angle this way, up and down, perfect angle this way, that's the other thing. If you're slightly off like this way or that way, then that shaft's going to come into the splines on the clutch disc crooked, and it's not going to want to line up. So you got to get it just perfect, which is a real pain in the ass. And then even then, they still might not line up because the tooths might be misaligned, you know, by a few millimeters. And I found out you can't viably turn the end tail shaft. So what you got to do to line it up is turn your crank pulley here. I believe that was a 7/8. You'll sit here and turn it like this. So basically you push it up until it's lined up as best as you think. Mine stopped on me because it kept the splines kept hitting and they weren't lining up due to various reasons, due to the angle and then also not having the teeth lined up. So you gotta kind of like get it to that point to where that, you know, they're touching, keep pressing against it, and then somebody's got to turn this at the same time to line the teeth up. So I'm going to be honest with you, it pretty much took me all day to get this thing back in here. So it's no easy feat. You got to get it, the transmission pitched just right, left and right, up and down, and then apply pressure to where the spline teeth are touching, and then turn the engine over so that shaft that the clutch rides on will spin the clutch, and you get those splines lined up. So it's not going to be super easy. Expect to fight with it. You want to be real careful. I managed to get a few of the bolts started while I still had the jack under it, just barely. And I kind of, because I was by myself, this is how I had to do it. You have to be real careful because you don't want it to get tight at all, because if you only get a few threads started, if you put any pressure on that at all, it'll just strip them out or strip out your case, and then you're going to be really screwed. So the previous method I was describing with help is the way you want to go. But I managed to get a few started and get light pressure pulling the transmission towards the engine, and then turn this over by hand, and then I got it to pop in. It took me several tries. It got stiff on me, and then it just kind of, I thought it was the compression building on the compression stroke, and then it like popped, and then it got way easier to turn. So that was the splines lining up. Really would not recommend that method, because you can't put any pressure against the clutch, or at least not very much, or you could bend it, bust the disc, you know, anything like that. I just really didn't have a choice, being by myself and with the limited tools and you know, jacks and whatnot that I had. That's kind of how I had to do it. But I definitely would not recommend that, because you can absolutely damage the clutch doing that. So you really got to know what you're doing if you do it the way I did it. But yeah, ideally you need to push this thing up until it touches and you have a gap, something like that. You need to have the pitch up and down just right, the pitch left and right with the transmission just right, so that the splines can slide in when they're lined up. Because even if you have them perfectly lined up, if you're slightly crooked, it's not going to go in because it's a perfect fit. So that's the real nightmare. And then you can apply pressure while it's touching, and then somebody else can turn the engine via the crank pulley until it lines up. And if you have all your angles right, they'll slide in together, and then you can push the transmission on the rest of the way and then bolt it up. Once I got it lined up to where the splines were actually lined up and would go inside of each other, it just slid right on. Prior, I kept pushing real hard and everything, and it just wouldn't budge. It kept hitting, and that's what that was. That was that shaft in the bell housing of the transmission making contact with the spline teeth on the clutch disc and not going in. So it was a real nightmare by myself trying to get the angle of the transmission just right, applying pressure at the same time while turning this by myself. But yeah, you're gonna want help, and that's how you do it. So sorry, I know that was a mouthful, but I'm trying to help you guys. Like I said, it took me all day. This is the hardest part, is getting the transmission line back up, especially if this is your setup and you don't have the option of getting the car above your head with the little dolly where you can easily move the transmission around under there. So if you're doing it like this, it's going to be quite a nightmare. So I wanted to be as descriptive as possible how to get it on there and what you got to look out for as far as not damaging anything. So now I just got to hook everything back up. As I said, I'll go over the torque specs. If I can find a torque spec on that, I'll throw it up, but you know, just snug that down is what I did. And I'm gonna run in town, and actually I forgot my axle nuts, because remember I said in the beginning of the video it's recommended to replace them. I'm gonna go ahead and replace them, and I'm also gonna replace my seal for the plug on the transmission before I fill it back up. But I'm gonna go grab this few small things, come back, got another 2 or 3 hours to go hooking everything back up, and we'll go over the torque specs. Of course, it won't be 2 or 3 hours for you guys, but that's what I got left, and then we'll be done. Take her for a test drive, and we'll talk about breaking in the clutch. All right, I got my drive shaft back in. You just, where am I at here? Just slide it in, transmission, line up the splines, and then you can bolt up your back piece there to the diff. Remember, if you marked it, to line up the marks. Those 4 bolts, 23 foot-pounds of torque, but it's pretty much impossible to get a torque wrench in there because you can't get a socket on those bolts. So basically, just snug them down good. Washer goes on the back side with the nut. The bolt has a flat edge on it. Make sure you line that up to where it'll go in all the way. The flat edge is cut out so it fits up against the joint section. 23 foot-pounds on those. I almost forgot this center drive shaft bolts down there where it holds the center up. Those are 38 foot-pounds of torque. You got to put your transmission brackets, cross members, and all that back in so you can put this shield back on because it bolts to them. So your 14mm head bolts, the smaller bolts, and the nuts up in here are 52 foot-pounds of torque. And then the 2 bigger ones that hold this cross member on, 17mm heads, they're 103 foot-pounds of torque.
So this here, as I said, if you're just setting a transmission down, I guess you didn't even really need to remove it. Don't forget your little washer that goes in there, and then put your pin back in.
There's this little plate here, remember, with the 3 bolts. So I'm going to put that back on real quick. Actually make that 2 bolts. For some reason I took that one out when I did that. I don't know why. This one looks identical except it's like 2mm shorter than these 2. So don't forget your shift linkage up in here if you disconnected any. If you're just setting it on the ground and the car's not too high like what I did, you don't even have to disconnect it. These, once you pull that slide lock out, they'll just come in and out like this. I thought they went in and out of that slot, but they don't. They just literally come back like that. The lever it attaches to, it's got 3 positions. I'm assuming forward, neutral, or reverse. So you want to put it in the middle position. It has 3 different positions. Put it in the middle for neutral, assuming your car is in neutral, and then hook your thing down there with the clip in it and all that, you know. Got shit in my mouth. What was I gonna say? That does extend and retract too, this cable, so like you can pull on it. Like if it accidentally got pulled on while you're moving the transmission and it's like clear out here, for example, you can push it back in, or if it's too far that way, for example, you can pull it back out while it's attached. So it will like slinky the line in and out of here if it's not in the correct position for you. Drain plug here on the transmission is 32 foot-pounds of torque. So I'm sliding the axles back in on both sides just to make sure it's clean before you stick it back in there. Make sure you ain't got no dirt or crap on there. Slide it through from the outside, and then get under here, and you gotta line the spline teeth up. Okay, once they're in this far, you're good. I can't see, it's turning the other side too. So once it's about this far in, then you know you got them lined up. If it's sticking out further and then you ain't got it lined up yet, you just turn it and push. Try a few different spots until they line up, shove it in. So I've got it that far, and then now I'm trying to push it past that snap ring. So I'm going to go to the outside and try to shove on the whole rod to get it to pop through. And actually that's pretty easy. If you just, this actually springs, if you remember we discussed it in the beginning, it springs like an accordion. It'll actually go in and out within the boot. If you push in slowly, it's going to slowly compress until everything touches, and then trying to shove it in is harder. What you want to do is let that be sprung out like it is, and just give it a hard jerk or two, and use that as a driving hammer. And actually the first try it snapped my axle in all the way. So just take this and jab it forward real hard a couple times, and it should drive that axle in the rest of the way. All right, remember, with all this hanging down, you can move it, manipulate it however you want. So you can get this side of the axle lined up, get it through, get the splines in there lined up. Then you want to get a jack under your wishbone here, control arm, A-arm, whatever you want to call it. Lift it up to the point to where you can get your bolts in there. And there's two. See the difference there? This one has a lump in it, and that's the only one that'll fit up top, so that's your top bolt. It's also a little longer. Also, don't do this. It only goes through one way. That lump creates an oval, and it's ovaled out on this side. It will not come through this side. It goes to that side. So I got this one in backwards. I need to come through the other side. Okay, again, washer on top, no washer on the bottom. And your torque spec on those are 113 foot-pounds of torque. Don't forget to hook your brake line back up there. Wheel speed sensor back up here. Remember, it's looped like this, and then it plugs in there as well. Don't forget your exhaust bracket that bolts to the transmission right there. I'm going to weld mine up real quick, since it broke on me before I even started. Also, your shift cables here, make sure they're not pinched, caught up on anything, and get them bolted back down to the transmission where they're supposed to be. Your slave cylinder lined up with your shift fork bolted back down. It's 27 foot-pounds of torque. Put some grease on there, which I already did, in between the joint. Remember, we got these down here we gotta get plugged back in, and this ground wire. Clip the black and white back in there. And then I guess I forgot, this goes there like that, and that long trans bolt there actually holds that on. So I gotta take that bolt back out, run it through this to bolt that up, plug it back in. All right, so this is what the transmission takes. Yes, I know it says gear oil. I noticed some of these in the shop, they said just gear oil like this, and some of them said gear oil and transmission fluid. That's because some more modern transmissions are taking 75-90 gear oil as their transmission fluid now, so some of them actually do denote and transmission. But whether it says gear oil or gear oil and transmission, it's the same damn thing. 75W90, okay? That's what it takes. Depending on what transmission you have, and I don't know if it's just because it's the STI was the other one, or if different years of the WRX have a different transmission. But this one specifically, 15 WRX 6-speed manual, it takes 3.5 quarts. There's one other transmission option. Like I said, it might just be the STI, or it might be a different year with a different trans. I'm not sure. The other one takes 4.1. This one 3.5. So refer to your owner's manual if you're not sure. You might be able to get the specifications from the auto parts store, or certainly your Subaru dealer with the VIN number. So let's see, where's it at? Right there. My finger's pointing at it. Right there is your dipstick tube. You can pull that out. That's where you're going to fill it up at. So you're going to need something like this to reach down in there, stick it through, fill it through that. Again, for me, 2015 WRX 3.5 quarts. One other thing to note real quick, from what I was reading, it needs to be GL5 rated, certified, whatever. I was going to get AMSOIL and put in it, which is better stuff, but I didn't see anywhere on it that it said GL5. I'm sure it would have been fine, but just to be on the safe side, I put GL5 certified in it, so that's why I skipped on the AMSOIL. Also, a little tip, I transferred it to this bottle. This stuff is really thick, so it pours really slowly. So if you just start dumping it down that, it's gonna overflow and get everywhere, which I kind of already did. I was already transferring to this, but yeah, it's really thick, so that's why I transferred to this. If you're trying to pour it out of those into a funnel into that, or you know, I guess a long funnel might work too, but regardless, it's real thick and pours real slow, so you're gonna have to pour it slowly and take your time, or it's gonna back up on you and overflow, and it might even do that at the point where you're putting it in the transmission if you go too fast. So I'm gonna use this little squeezer bottle with a little tip like that.
So I was talking about the axle nuts here, and I tried to get new axle nuts, but my parts store didn't have any. It was a dealer only thing. I had to get the car back on the road, so I just ended up reusing the old ones. Torque it down to 162 foot-pounds of torque. You'll have to have the wheel off so that you can tap that metal down the where it's supposed to be in that notch. So you'll have to have somebody hold on the brakes so that you can do that.
I got to put my intercooler back on, reconnect the battery, and it should be good to go. Double check, triple check everything underneath the car and above. So I'd go ahead and do that while you have the intercooler off. That way you can get to all this, double check, triple check everything, make sure you didn't miss nothing, then throw your intercooler on. So that's what I'm going to do now, because I've already double, triple checked everything. Reconnect the battery so I can start the car, have someone stand on the brakes so I can torque my axle nut down. It's 162 foot-pounds of torque. If your torque wrench only goes to 150, then you can go to 150 and then just give it the smallest amount more turn. I mean the smallest, like 1/100th of a turn, and that should put you on 160s if you can achieve 150. Alright, got the intercooler back on, battery hooked back up, ran it through all the gears first. Well, actually I did that a while ago after I had everything hooked up to make sure it goes through all the gears fine. Put the car off. Let's try with it on, clutch down. First, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. Not my car, can you tell? Reverse, cool. Alright, gonna go take it for a little test drive, make sure all is well, but that's it. That's the full install. ACT, I know my clutch isn't ACT, but the instructions that came with ACT recommend 300 to 500 light street driven miles for break-in of your new clutch. So basically just drive like a normal person, don't go full throttle. Obviously with this being a boosted car, you don't have to go full throttle to experience maximum acceleration, so just basically stay out of the boost, don't accelerate very briskly, just drive like a normal person. Don't dump the clutch, don't drag the clutch too long, you know, just take it easy on it for 300 to 500 miles. Me personally, I'm gonna go 500, and then you should be good to go. So that's it. If this video helped you out at all, make sure you leave a like. Thanks for watching, and catch you guys on the next one. We're doing a Cobb access port next, cold air intake, and probably eventually some exhaust mods, and like the charge pipe and stuff like that, maybe eventually the J pipe and all that. So we have modifications. We currently have the Cobb and the intake, so we'll be doing that next, and we have more planned. So if you don't want to miss that, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. Well, I've been driving around for about 10 or 15 minutes. All is well. It grabs a lot sooner. It grabs a lot harder. So should be good to go. I just gotta get broken in now.